this week we're doing art. Welcome to week 3 of unit 1 of Mathematical Literacy. Today we are learning words that will help us to thrive in art. Specifically, we are looking at the vocabulary of colour. Before we start, see how I've spelled colour with a U in it. Now you might have seen it without the U, and that's the American spelling. Now there's a lot of snobbery to do with British spellings versus American spellings in the UK, I think, because people seem to think that the Americans took a language that was perfectly fine and changed it. And at some point we might actually do a video on Noah Webster, who made all of those changes or most of those changes in the American language. But for today, we're just touching on the difference when it comes to colour and colour. So British spelling is the more complicated one with the U in. You'll see that in words like honour as well, that U. Whereas in America, they spell both words without the U. That snobbery is a little bit misplaced at times because the American version is actually just reverting to the original Latin word, which was colour. And it was spelled in exactly the same way as the American word is. So today we're looking at art and a surprising amount of science. Words that will help us in art, you say, but doesn't a picture speak 1,000 words, you say? Isn't that the whole point, you say? Well, a considerable vocabulary can help us even in the visual arts, so let's get started. Our specific focus today is the vocabulary of colour, and colour is so important to us. Whether we're artists or not, the colour of our clothes or lack of colour of our clothes, the colour of the possessions that we buy, of our hair, of our makeup, all of these choices we feel go towards our identity in some way. So the more vocabulary we have to do with colour, the more we can explore those ideas. This video so far has been in black and white. You may be used to calling images like this black and white, or you may call them grayscale. That's when we've got from black to white with all the greys in between making up the whole image. And you can still have a really detailed image with these colours or lack of colours. And this is bringing us to our first word, which is monochromatic. Monochromatic. Now this word comes from the ancient Greek terms monos, meaning alone, single, sole, one, and the Greek word chroma for colour. So these are ancient Greek words that these are coming out from. So monos and chroma. Unlike the phrases that we mentioned before, black and white and grayscale, they're specifically talking about using greys and whites and blacks. So like this, grayscale. That can be monochromatic, but monochromatic can also refer to the use of any colour as long as that is the only colour being used. All shades of that colour. For example, you can be monochromatic in blue, or monochromatic in green. You could be monochromatic in yellow. Monochromatic means any image that is made up solely from tints and shades of one colour. But most things that we look at are not monochromatic. They're made up of lots of different colours. And this is because we are trichromatic creatures. The chromatic in trichromatic means the same as it did in monochromatic. It means colour. The tri, can you guess what tri means? Tri means 3. So trichromatic means that we can process 3 colours, but that doesn't sound right. I don't know about you, but I can see more than 3 colours. This is where it all gets a little bit sciencey. Our eyes have these little cells in them called cone cells. This is about art, but it's also intensely science-based. These little cone cells, we've got 3 different types of them in our eyes. That's why we're trichromatic. Now, one of these little cone cells can understand really short wavelengths of light. That's the colour blue. One of them can understand medium wavelengths of light. That cone cell can understand the colour red. And the last cone cell, or the last type of cone cell in our eye, can understand really long wavelengths. And that can understand like yellows and greens. We know these 3 colours, red, blue, and like a yellowy green, as the primary colours. They're technically the only colours that we can see. 3 colours trichromatic. Yellow, red and blue, primary colours, the ones that you know in art, the basis from which we get colours. Luckily, our eyes are very clever. They don't want the world to be made up of only 3 colours. So the cones work together and understand mixtures of different wavelengths as well. Essentially, they're doing what you do when you paint. They're like taking a mixture of the different colours that each cone cell can see. They're working together. And through this, we get the secondary colours. Again, you'll know these from art. Blue and yellow makes like a proper green. So your eyes could already see a bit of green, but they couldn't see intense green. We can get a whole range by mixing the yellow with the blue. When the cone cell that understands red works with the cone cell that understands yellow, we get orange. And when the cone cell that understands red works with the one that understands blue, we can see purple. This is the same with paint. They are the colours that we would mix to get those secondary colours. And this brings us to our next piece of vocabulary, tertiary. In Latin, tertius means third. So this is the third group of colours. You get them by mixing a primary colour with a secondary colour. Or in terms of our eyes, when the cones accept a different amount of light from each wavelength until it adds up to about that mixture of being a primary colours amount with a secondary colours amount. And these are the interesting colours, and they're the ones that you probably don't know the name for all of them for. So here's a list of the tertiary colours. You may well know them by these very descriptive names, blue-green or yellowy-green, but they have real names as well. And they are amber, vermilion, magenta, violet, teal, my favourite colour, and chartreuse. Colours are a great example of how increasing your vocabulary can allow you to be so much more specific. But interestingly, not everybody is trichromatic. When people are colourblind, usually it just means that one of those cones is faulty. They're still trichromatic, but they've got a faulty cone. But some people are actually born with one less cone cell in their eye, or one less type of cone cell. That makes them dichromatic. So depending on which cone it is, their vision is entirely different because they might lack all red or all blue or all yellow. So this is called dichromatic, from the ancient Greek word for two, di, and colour. Did you know that all dogs are dichromatic? As are lots of predators, because a lot of predators, like, colour isn't very important to them. Scientists think that we became trichromatic back in primate times, where we had to recognize ripe fruit on a tree. So it became very useful for us to have colour. So we evolved this extra cone cell. We don't even have the best cones. Some birds or fish are tetrachromatic. This means that they have four, so they can see four different basic colours. And apparently it is technically possible for some people to be tetrachromatic as well. Usually the prefix for four is quad, like a quad bike. But that's the Latin word for four. Remember, everything that we've talked about today, other than tertiary, that was a Latin word, everything else has been ancient Greek. And the ancient Greek word for four is tetra. So trichromatic, dichromatic, monochromatic, tetrachromatic, these are all ancient Greek terms. And now you'll be able to deal with ancient Greek prefixes like that. Back to art. I hear you telling me that not all of your favourite colours have been mentioned yet. Come on, Miss McMullen, I hear you say. What about my favourite turquoise? I love turquoise too. Or rose blush pink. Where is blood red? Lilac. Well, we have all of our main colours now, our primary, our secondary, and our tertiary, but we haven't touched on shades and tints. Now, a shade is a colour created by adding black. You can do this with a primary colour, you can do this with a secondary colour, you can do this with a tertiary colour. You add a little bit of black to make it darker. Deep blood red, tiny little bit of black in your red. Boom, done. Deep royal blue, tiny little bit of black in your blue. Boom, done. Only a tiny little bit, otherwise it just turns into strange sludge. Bit of black, sort it right out. That is a shade. Shade doesn't come from either Greek or Latin. It comes from Old English. And before that, the term was Germanic. The word, excuse my pronunciation, is shadu, skadu, skadu. I should have checked that. This is a good way to remember that shade is by adding black and it's darker because it's the same word that eventually became shadow. So based on that, the fact that black is, adding a little bit of black is shading, what might tinting be? Well, yes, you're right. Tinting is to add white, or more specifically, to add a little bit of colour to your white, because it comes from the Latin word tinctere. We're all over the place today, aren't we? We've got Latin, we've got ancient Greek, we've got Germanic, Old English. Well, tinctere is to add colour. So it makes more sense to think of it as adding a little bit of colour to your white to create a softer version of that colour. This is where we get things like our pastels from, that rose blush pink, that lilac. These come from adding a little bit of colour to your white. So we've covered a lot of words today, and we found a lot of useful prefixes that will help us to decode words in the future. So today I want you to create a dual code for yourself. You remember the dual code symbols? These are some of the ones that we've made before. And I want you to come up with your own definition to monochromatic, tertiary colours, tints and shades. The others are bonuses, but if you want to create dual codes and definitions for them too, then that will just add to your vocabulary and make you an even more profound thinker. It is a good idea to keep a journal or a notebook for this vocabulary as you're inquiring it, so that you can go back to it and refresh your memory. We'll have some quizzes later on in the unit so that we can see how much you've retained. And today, if you're watching with somebody, if you compare your dual code and definitions and see whose was the most clear. If not, if you're working alone, you can go back through this video and check your definition with my definition and see whether it is clear. So I spoke at you a lot today. And I also think that I proved that when we think about things as being separate in terms of subject, that's a little bit of an oversimplification, because to thoroughly understand the words behind art, you have to understand the science and the movement of language, and by combining all of them you become a wonderful, well-rounded thinker. So have a trichromatic week, unless you are colourblind, and I hope that you enjoy a vast array of colours, primary, secondary and of course tertiary. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for another week on Macmo Literacy. If you enjoy starting with a word and then ending up in a rambling journey to who knows where, then I suggest that you hit like and subscribe. Also, if you just want to be a pal, like and subscribe. See you next week.